She was just a 16-year-old girl waiting to board her flight home, hoodie up, earbuds in, scrolling through her phone like any other teen. But in the span of minutes, Nicole Harris went from a quiet passenger at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport to being interrogated in a private TSA screening room, treated like a threat. What sparked this sudden scrutiny? A suspicious stare from a stranger, and the wrong assumptions by airport staff. They questioned her travel plans, searched her bag as if she were hiding something, and even demanded to take her photo, for documentation. But the real twist? They had no idea who her father was, or what would happen when he arrived. A high-powered civil rights attorney, calm as stone, ready to tear down their entire process, piece by piece. What he said changed everything. Want to know how this confrontation ended, and why the internet exploded afterward? Stick around, and don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments. 16-year-old Nicole Harris wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just waiting to board her flight at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. She had come to Arizona for a basketball camp and was finally heading home to Indianapolis. Her mother had booked everything weeks in advance, double-checked the details like always. Nicole had flown alone before without any trouble. That morning, she wore her favorite hoodie, slipped in her earbuds, and claimed a seat near her gate. Her phone screen glowed as she texted friends and scrolled through social media. Everything felt routine, until it didn't. It started with a woman sitting a few seats away. Nicole noticed her gaze, the kind that lingers just a little too long. The woman's expression wasn't curious, it was suspicious, cold. Nicole tried to ignore it. But soon after, an airport staff member approached, asking to see her boarding pass. Then her ID. Then came more questions. Was she traveling alone? Where were her parents? Had she flown before? Nicole answered politely, a bit confused. No one else in the waiting area was being questioned. That's when it hit her, this wasn't random. She was being singled out, scrutinized not because of her behavior, but because of how she looked. Nicole was a young black girl, traveling solo in a mostly white airport terminal. Her hoodie, her age, her presence, it all seemed to make her a target. She tried to stay calm, remembering what her parents always told her, don't raise your voice. Don't give them an excuse. But the situation kept escalating. She was led to a separate screening room by TSA officers, where they treated her like a suspect. They rummaged through her backpack, asked if she carried cash, if she had ever been in trouble with the law, if she was really from Indianapolis. One officer even asked to take her photo, for documentation. Nicole had done nothing wrong. No rule had been broken. No alarm had been triggered. Yet she was being interrogated and humiliated while passengers continued boarding their flights uninterrupted. This wasn't about safety. It was about bias. About the quiet, persistent undercurrent of racism that still runs through American institutions, often cloaked as policy or protocol. Nicole wasn't a threat. She was a teenager. But in that moment, her skin color made her suspicious in the eyes of people with power. As Nicole sat frozen in that cold room, fear gave way to something deeper, anger. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you're being mistreated for simply existing. And just when it felt like no one would stand up for her, the door opened, and everything changed. The moment Nicole Harris stepped into the secondary screening room, the difference in tone was immediate, and chilling. The space was quiet, sterile, and felt more like an interrogation chamber than a safety checkpoint. Two more TSA officers waited inside, one tall and wiry, the other stocky with crossed arms and a skeptical glare that barely masked his assumptions. "Set your bag down," the female officer said, her voice clipped and practiced. Nicole obeyed, trying to stay composed, though her fingers trembled as she unclipped her backpack. She had nothing to hide, but that didn't seem to matter. They started asking more invasive questions. Where are you flying? Who paid for your ticket? Do you have family in Phoenix? Are you carrying cash? The barrage felt endless. Nicole answered everything truthfully. She was headed home to Indianapolis, her mom had bought the ticket, and no, she wasn't carrying any cash, just a debit card. Still, the agents wrote on clipboards and exchanged glances, as if waiting for her to slip up. Then came the request for a photo. For documentation, they said. That's when Nicole hesitated. No, she said softly, yet firmly. The room instantly grew colder. Are you refusing to cooperate? One agent snapped. Her refusal, though quiet and lawful, was seen as defiance, not because of her tone, but because of who she was. Had she been a white teenager in yoga pants with a suitcase full of Starbucks and souvenirs, no one would have thought twice. But a black girl, in a hoodie, alone. She was now a security risk. The staff reached for their radios. One officer threatened to remove her from the airport. Another accused her of causing a scene. Nicole's voice cracked as she tried to explain, but no one was listening. They had already made up their minds. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was racial profiling in real time, unfolding beneath the fluorescent lights of a modern American airport. A place meant to be secure had become a stage for systemic bias. Nicole was being treated as suspicious not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. Her identity alone was enough to trigger fear, judgment, and exclusion. She had no history of trouble. No weapons. No drugs. Nothing illegal. Just a hoodie, a backpack, and the wrong skin tone. As the threat of being escorted out grew more real, Nicole made the one call that changed everything. She called her father. And they didn't know it yet, but the people who were trying to intimidate her were about to face someone they couldn't ignore, Terrence Harris, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. When Terrence Harris entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He didn't need to raise his voice or flash credentials. His presence alone, tall, calm, commanding in a navy blue suit, was enough to make the TSA agents straighten their postures and exchange uneasy glances. Nicole, still standing with her bag half-zipped, felt her breath finally catch. Her father had arrived, and with him came not just protection, but power. "Who's in charge here?" Terrence asked, his voice cool but firm. One officer, a stocky man with a badge, stepped forward, trying to maintain authority. "Sir, this is a restricted area." "Not anymore," Terrence replied, holding up his phone. "I've already spoken with the airport's general counsel. They're aware of who I am, and they're aware that my daughter has been detained without cause." The room went silent. The woman in the blazer, the same one who had interrogated Nicole earlier, cleared her throat. "Mr. Harris, we followed standard procedure. Her ticket was flagged for additional screening." "How many other passengers on that flight were flagged?" Terrence asked without missing a beat. No one answered. He stepped forward, placing his business card on the desk between them. "You searched her bag, questioned her about her family, accused her of being uncooperative, and threatened to remove her from the airport. All without a single shred of evidence, based solely on how she looked. That's not protocol. That's racial profiling." The TSA officers shifted uncomfortably. Nicole watched as their once authoritative expressions began to crack. For the first time, they seemed to realize this wouldn't be swept under the rug. Terrence wasn't just a father. He was a man who had spent over 2 decades defending people who had been discriminated against, wrongfully accused, wrongfully detained, and yes, wrongfully profiled. "This isn't just about my daughter," he continued. "It's about every child who's ever been made to feel like a suspect for simply existing. You owe her more than an apology, you owe her accountability." Patricia Dawson, the airport administrator, finally stepped forward. "Mr. Harris, we deeply regret." "Save it," he interrupted. "You regret it because I showed up. Because you assumed she was alone. Because you thought no one would notice. But now, everyone will notice." Nicole stood beside her father, feeling the weight of his words settle over the room. She was still shaken, still angry, but no longer afraid. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her experience, humiliating, unfair, and deeply personal, was now undeniable evidence of how racial bias quietly infiltrates even the most neutral of places. Terrence wasn't finished. "You're going to walk her back to her gate. You're going to apologize. And then, you're going to prepare for the formal complaint I'll be filing, with the TSA, with the airport, and with the Department of Justice if necessary." And they did. Quietly. Ashamed. Because for the first time that day, they were the ones being watched. The walk back to Gate B12 felt surreal. Nicole Harris kept her head high, her father walking beside her like a shield. Behind them trailed the same officials who had interrogated her: Patricia Dawson, the airport administrator, James Wilcox, the lead TSA officer, and the once intimidating security guard who now looked anywhere but at her. Minutes earlier, they had acted with unchecked authority, certain they were in control. Now, they walked in silence, their confidence drained by the reality of what they had done, and who they had done it to. Passengers turned their heads as the group passed. Some recognized Nicole from earlier, when she was pulled away without explanation. Others simply noticed the tension and the unmistakable shift in power. It was no longer a young girl being questioned, it was officials being held accountable. At the gate, Nicole's seat remained empty, her bag untouched beneath the chair, as if frozen in time. Terrence stopped and turned, arms folded, staring directly at the staff. "Well," he said. Patricia hesitated, her professional composure fraying under the weight of public scrutiny. "Miss Harris," she began, "we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." Nicole raised an eyebrow. "Inconvenience," she repeated. Wilcox cleared his throat. "We regret the misunderstanding." Terrence let out a low, humorless laugh. "No," he said, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. You saw a young black girl sitting alone, wearing a hoodie, and assumed the worst. You didn't see her humanity, you saw your bias. And you acted on it." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match could have been. Around them, passengers listened. Some recorded. Some nodded silently. Others simply watched, bearing witness to a moment that reflected a much larger truth. This was not an isolated incident, it was a symptom of something systemic. Terrence turned to Patricia. "Do you have children?" She nodded slowly. "Then imagine this was your daughter. Imagine her being treated like a criminal for simply waiting to go home. Would an apology be enough for you?" Patricia couldn't answer. Nicole clenched her backpack strap, her voice steadier than she expected. "You didn't ask anyone else those questions." "Just me. And I know why." Her words weren't angry, they were honest. And in their simplicity, they carried the weight of a history too many people still try to ignore. The moment marked a quiet victory, but a costly one. Nicole had been humiliated, her dignity chipped away piece by piece, all because someone saw her skin before they saw her smile. But now, the script had flipped. Her father turned to her. 10 minutes until boarding," he said. "You ready?" She nodded. Behind them, the staff stood still, silent, shaken, and suddenly very aware that their actions were no longer hidden behind institutional excuses. As Nicole Harris boarded her flight, the usual hum of airport announcements and luggage wheels rolling seemed distant, muffled beneath the roar of everything she had just endured. She found her seat by the window, placed her backpack under the chair in front of her, and sat down slowly, her body still tense. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass and exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The sun was starting to set over Phoenix, casting long amber shadows across the tarmac, shadows that mirrored the weight still hanging over her chest. But Nicole wasn't alone anymore. As she settled into her seat, her father, Terrence Harris, remained just outside the gate, already typing on his phone. Nicole knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't going to let this disappear into silence like so many stories before. He was writing, carefully, precisely, the same way he did when building civil rights cases in court. Names. Times. Locations. Specifics. No exaggeration. Just truth. And then he hit send. Within minutes, the post appeared on his firm's website and across social media platforms. The headline was clear: 16-year-old black teen racially profiled at Phoenix airport while traveling alone. It included direct quotes, a timeline of events, and a photo of Nicole's boarding pass, time-stamped, proving her innocence. Nicole refreshed her phone. The comments were already rolling in. Unacceptable. I'd sue. This could have been my granddaughter. Happens too often and no one pays attention. Until now. She was so brave. Proud of her and her dad. Each comment made Nicole's chest tighten in a different way, part shame, part strength. She hadn't asked to become a symbol. She hadn't asked for attention. She had just wanted to go home. But now, people were paying attention. A woman a few rows ahead turned slightly in her seat and gave Nicole a knowing nod. A man passing by glanced at her, then at her phone, as if connecting the dots. Nicole didn't know if they had seen the post or simply sensed something different, but for the first time that day, she didn't feel invisible. Terrence's post wasn't just a reaction, it was a call for accountability. And people were listening. Thousands of shares, hundreds of comments, and counting. Activists reposted it. Journalists reached out. Civil rights groups began tagging the TSA and airport administration directly. Nicole turned to look down the aisle. The same officials who had interrogated her, Patricia Dawson, James Wilcox, and the security staff, stood in a quiet huddle near the gate, speaking in hushed voices. Their posture was no longer confident, it was defensive. They hadn't expected a response like this. They had assumed she'd leave quietly, ashamed, and disappear into the crowd. They had assumed wrong. As the plane lifted off the runway, Nicole Harris stared out the window, her thoughts far heavier than the luggage stored below. The city lights of Phoenix grew smaller beneath her, but the memory of what had happened just hours ago refused to shrink with them. She replayed every moment, the first suspicious glance, the firm hand on her shoulder, the cold questions in the sterile TSA room, and the disbelief in their eyes when her father walked in. This wasn't something she could just leave behind at 30,000 feet. Nicole opened her notes app and began typing. Not for anyone else, at least not yet, but for herself. I was humiliated today, she wrote, but I wasn't alone. And I will never forget how they looked at me, not because I did something wrong, but because they assumed I had. Around her, the plane was quiet. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with drink carts, passengers scrolled their phones or watched in-flight movies. It felt strange that life kept moving when hers had so clearly been disrupted. But maybe that was the point, so many people live through these moments, and the world keeps turning, unaware or unwilling to see. She glanced at her phone again. Her father's post had already crossed 10,000 shares. Civil rights organizations had reposted it. A major journalist had commented, asking for an interview. Support flooded in from strangers, black parents saying this was their worst fear, white allies expressing outrage, teens across the country saying, this could have been me. The incident was no longer a private injustice. It had become public evidence. Nicole looked down the aisle, imagining how differently things might have gone if she hadn't made that call. If her father hadn't answered. If he hadn't been who he was. She thought of the kids who wouldn't have had a Terrence Harris to show up for them. Kids who would have been removed from the airport. Silenced. Forgotten. That realization settled into her chest like a stone. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about how easily it could have been someone else, and how often it probably was. She typed again, they thought I was alone. I wasn't. And now the world knows what they did. With a deep breath, she hit post. As the flight continued eastward, the comments section exploded with encouragement, rage, and resolve. People weren't just watching, they were organizing. Demanding TSA review policies. Calling for Patricia Dawson and James Wilcox to be investigated. This was no longer just a story. It was a movement. Nicole leaned back, her grip on her phone loosening. The fear hadn't fully gone, but something else had taken its place. Strength. Resolve. Voice. When Nicole Harris stepped off the plane in Indianapolis, the air felt heavier than she expected, not from the humidity, but from the weight of what she had just lived through. Her mom was waiting at the gate, arms wide open. Nicole walked straight into them, holding on a few seconds longer than usual. No words were needed. Her mom already knew. By the time the plane had landed, her phone had buzzed with dozens of alerts, texts, and news headlines. The story had gone national. Major media outlets had picked it up, CNN, MSNBC, and even local stations across the Midwest. Nicole's post had been quoted word for word, "I was humiliated today, but I wasn't alone." Her father, Terrence Harris, had appeared on live interviews that same evening, calmly but firmly calling for an investigation into racial profiling at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. The names of those involved, Patricia Dawson, James Wilcox, and the unidentified security agents, were now under intense scrutiny. But something even bigger was happening. Across the country, young black travelers began sharing similar stories, moments when they were stopped, questioned, searched, and treated like suspects for no clear reason. Hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #IStandWithNicole began trending. Civil rights organizations demanded federal oversight of TSA screening procedures. Several lawmakers called for hearings. Nicole watched it all unfold from the living room couch that night, wrapped in a blanket, her phone lighting up every few seconds. She was still processing it. The fear, the violation, the shame, but also the pride. She hadn't planned to become a voice for anyone. But now that it had happened, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to be silent. By the end of the week, the airport issued an official statement acknowledging the incident and promising a full review. Patricia Dawson was placed on leave pending investigation. TSA headquarters announced a commitment to re-evaluating its discretionary screening protocols after public outcry demanded change. It wasn't justice yet, but it was a step forward. Nicole's story had started with a stare, a search, and an assumption. But it ended with thousands of voices saying, "This isn't okay. Not anymore." And for every young person who had ever been stopped, doubted, or degraded simply because of how they looked, Nicole's courage offered something more powerful than anger, it offered hope. If you believe stories like Nicole's matter, if you've ever seen injustice and knew it had to be called out, don't stay silent. Share this story. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And subscribe to our channel, Life's Hidden Gems, where we give voice to the truth others try to ignore. Because silence protects injustice. But truth changes everything. What happened to Nicole Harris is a painful reminder that even today, in places meant to be safe and neutral, racial bias still finds its way in. It teaches us that how we look can still determine how we're treated, but it also shows us the power of standing up, speaking out, and not letting silence protect injustice. Whether you're a parent, a grandparent, or someone who's seen this story play out too many times, let Nicole's courage and her father's calm strength remind us, your voice matters. And when used with purpose, it can create real change. If this story made you feel something, anger, pride, hope, don't just scroll away. Like this video, leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you believe stories like Nicole's deserve to be heard, subscribe to our channel, Life's Hidden Gems. We're here to tell the stories others try to bury, because truth deserves a spotlight.